In the early 1950s, Eddie Fisher was perhaps the most beloved young singer in America. Harry Truman loved him. Eisenhower loved him. Teenage girls across the country bought his records, watched his television show, and wrote him letters by the hundreds of thousands. He had come from almost nothing, from a South Philadelphia neighborhood of Russian Jewish immigrants, and he had become, through the specific alchemy of talent and timing, and a voice that the era seemed to be waiting for, the biggest thing in popular music. And then, in 1958, his best friend died in a plane crash. And what happened in the months that followed cost Eddie Fisher everything he had spent his life building: his reputation, his marriage, his career, and ultimately his standing in the world he had fought so hard to enter. The story of how all of that happened is the story of ambition and friendship and desire and the specific cruelty of the American public when someone they have decided to love decides to disappoint them. South Philadelphia and the boy with the voice. The story begins where Eddie Fisher began, in South Philadelphia in 1928, in the cramped and vital world of working-class immigrant America. Edwin Jack Fisher was born on August 10th, 1928, the fourth of 7 children born to Gita and Joseph Tisch, Russian Jewish immigrants who had made their way to Philadelphia and were building their American life with the combination of determination and precariousness that defined immigrant households of that era. His father's surname had been changed from Tisch to Fisher by the time of the 1940 census, part of the same ongoing process of American assimilation that reshaped names and identities across immigrant communities throughout the early 20th century. Joseph worked as a vegetable and fruit vendor. Not a stable trade, not a prosperous one, but a trade that kept the family fed in a neighborhood where the margins were thin. The family called the boy Sonny Boy, a nickname taken from the Al Jolson song of the same name, a connection to the Jewish American entertainment tradition that the household clearly valued and that the boy would eventually carry far beyond anything his parents could have imagined. South Philadelphia, in the 1930s and early 1940s, was a neighborhood of dense social life. Families who knew each other across generations, of the block-level community that urban immigrant neighborhoods created as a mechanism for mutual survival. It was not comfortable by any material standard, but it was also a neighborhood where talent was visible and celebrated, where the local amateur shows and radio programs that constituted the entertainment infrastructure of the era gave young people with ability a way to demonstrate what they had to audiences who were genuinely interested in seeing it. Fisher demonstrated what he had early. He was singing at local shows before he was a teenager, winning the Horn and Hard Art Children's Hour radio contest in 1941 when he was 13. By the time he was 15, he had graduated to Philadelphia radio. His voice was even then the specific kind of instrument that the American popular music of the late 1940s and early 1950s rewarded. A clear, warm, lyric tenor with an emotional directness that communicated intimacy across the distance of radio and early television. He sang the way that the era wanted to be sung to, and the era noticed. He attracted the attention of Eddie Cantor, one of the most prominent comedians and entertainers in American show business, a man of enormous industry influence who had himself come from the Jewish immigrant world of New York's Lower East Side, and who understood, immediately, what the young singer from South Philadelphia had. Cantor was not simply a television and radio personality. He was a genuine power in the industry, someone whose endorsement could make a career and whose connections reached every significant venue and network and record label. He took Fisher under his wing, brought him onto his radio program, made introductions, opened doors that would otherwise have been years away. The United States Army opened a different kind of door in 1951. Fisher was drafted, served from 1951 to 1953, and used the service years not as an interruption of his career, but as an extension of it. He performed for troops. He made guest television appearances in uniform, billed as PFC Eddie Fisher, and the combination of the uniform and the voice and the boyish face made him simultaneously a symbol of national service and an entertainment phenomenon. By the time he was discharged, he had been in front of the American public continuously for 2 years in the most sympathetic possible context, and the public knew exactly who he was. By 1953, he had his own television program, Coke Time with Eddie Fisher, sponsored by the Coca-Cola Company. The Coca-Cola contract was worth $1 million, a deal of such magnitude that it was almost without precedent for a young performer in that era, and that both reflected and amplified Fisher's position as one of the most commercially significant entertainers in the country. The show ran from 1953 to 1957. He was recording prolifically for RCA Victor, producing a string of hits that made him one of the best-selling recording artists in the world. He was selling out concert venues across America. He was the singer that presidents invited to perform at official events. Harry Truman loved him. Dwight Eisenhower loved him. The New York Times described him as having bridged the gap between Frank Sinatra and Elvis Presley as the top teen singing idol of the 1950s. In the cultural moment between the era of Sinatra's dominance and the arrival of rock and roll's complete transformation of the popular music landscape, Eddie Fisher was the figure that American teenagers and young adults organized themselves around. He was what they listened to, what they screamed for at concerts, what they wrote fan letters to by the hundreds of thousands. And in 1955, he married Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart and America's most beloved couple. Debbie Reynolds was, by 1955, already a significant figure in American popular culture in her own right. Born Mary Frances Reynolds in El Paso, Texas, in 1932, she had arrived in Hollywood as a teenager with no formal training, won a beauty contest that led to a Warner Brothers contract, and had made her way to MGM through a combination of energy, determination, and a comedic instinct that the studio recognized immediately as something marketable. She appeared in 2 Weeks with Love in 1950 and demonstrated in that modest vehicle enough genuine charm and enough natural timing that the studio began building her career with purpose. Singin' in the Rain in 1952 was the film that made her famous. The film is now recognized as perhaps the greatest musical in the history of American cinema, and Reynolds's performance in it, as Kathy Selden, the earnest ingenue whose voice is used to replace the screeching of a silent film star, holds up as genuinely lovely work. She was 19 years old when the film was released, and the combination of her specific luminous quality and the film's quality made her someone that the American public immediately and completely embraced. The press combined Fisher and Reynolds under the label America's Sweethearts, and the label was not merely promotional. It reflected something genuine about how the couple presented themselves and how they were received. They were, in the photography and the interviews and the television appearances of the period, the visible embodiment of the young, optimistic, prosperous American life that the post-war decade had promised. They were both talented. They were both photogenic. They were both, in the public's eye, representatives of an American ideal. The boy from South Philly who made good. The girl from El Paso who became a movie star. The specific appeal of both of them was built on accessibility and warmth, and together they radiated a quality that the public found genuinely irresistible. They married on September 26, 1955. Their daughter, Carrie Fisher, was born in October 1956. Their son, Todd Fisher, was born on February 24, 1958. Named, pointedly and affectionately, for the man who had by that point become the closest friend both of them had outside their marriage. That man was Mike Todd. And what happened to Mike Todd is what started everything else. Mike Todd, the friend at the center of everything. Michael Todd was one of the most flamboyant and energetic personalities in the American entertainment world of the 1950s. Born Avrom Hirsch, Goldbogen in Minneapolis in 1909, the son of a Polish rabbi, he had changed his name in the characteristic pattern of Jewish American entertainers of his generation, and had built himself into one of the more singular figures in Broadway, producing, and later, film production. He had no formal education to speak of. He had dropped out of school early and made his way through a sequence of business ventures, many of which failed, some of which succeeded spectacularly. He was a showman in the grand theatrical tradition, larger than life, capable of both genuine vision and spectacular recklessness, possessed of the specific kind of personality that generates legend precisely because it generates both disasters and triumphs at a scale that ordinary people don't approach. He had produced successful Broadway shows in the 1940s, had been involved in the development of Cinerama, the panoramic widescreen film process, and had eventually developed his own widescreen process, Todd AO, which was used to film Oklahoma in 1955. His greatest achievement was the 1956 film Around the World in 80 Days, the adaptation of Jules Verne's novel that became one of the most commercially successful films of the decade, winning the Academy Award for Best Picture. The film's production had been a characteristically Todd operation, enormous in scope, financially precarious throughout, ultimately triumphant in a way that seemed to justify the entire reckless enterprise in retrospect. Mike Todd was the kind of man who could pull that off because he believed, in the most complete possible way, that he could pull anything off. And because the combination of charisma and calculation and sheer nerve that he brought to every undertaking was genuinely formidable. He met Elizabeth Taylor in 1956. Taylor was 23, newly divorced from Michael Wilding, and already the most physically beautiful woman in American cinema. Todd was 47. He pursued her with the same extravagant boldness he brought to every other aspect of his life, lavishing her with gifts, with attention, with the specific energy of a man who had decided he wanted something and was not interested in waiting. They married in February 1957, on a yacht off the coast of Acapulco. It was Taylor's third marriage. Fisher was Todd's best man. Debbie Reynolds was Taylor's matron of honor. The two couples were, in the specific warmth of late 1950s friendship, a genuine unit, double dating, vacationing together, appearing in each other's photographs with the easy informality of people who have known each other long enough to stop performing for the camera. When Debbie Reynolds gave birth to their son in February 1958, they named the boy Todd. The naming was an act of genuine love for the man it honored. 4 weeks after the birth of his namesake, Mike Todd was dead. The plane crash that started everything. On March 22, 1958, Mike Todd boarded his private plane, a twin-engine Lockheed Lodestar that he had named the Liz in honor of his wife, at Burbank Airport in California, bound for New York. He was traveling to appear on a television program. Elizabeth Taylor had been scheduled to accompany him, but had developed bronchitis and remained in Los Angeles. The plane crashed near Grants, New Mexico, in the early hours of March 22nd, killing everyone aboard. Mike Todd was 49 years old. Elizabeth Taylor had lost her husband. She was 25 years old, had been married to Todd for barely a year, and had been, by all accounts, deeply and genuinely in love with him in a way that her previous marriages had not produced. The grief was total and immediate, and devastatingly visible. Eddie Fisher was, by every consistent account, equally devastated. He and Mike Todd had been the kind of friends that the word best only begins to describe. The friendship had been the primary male bond of Fisher's adult life, the relationship that had shaped his understanding of himself and his place in the world in ways that went beyond the ordinary. He lost his closest friend and his mentor in a single morning. The grief was real. And the grief was also, in the months that followed, the mechanism through which everything else happened. The consolation that became a scandal. In the weeks and months after Mike Todd's death, Eddie Fisher was the person who spent the most time with Elizabeth Taylor in her grief. He flew to her. He sat with her. He was present in the specific way of someone who understood the loss from the inside, who had also lost Mike Todd, who shared the grief rather than simply observing it from outside. His presence made sense. His devotion to her well-being in the immediate period after the crash was something that even the press initially treated as the natural expression of his friendship with the dead man he had loved. Debbie Reynolds was home with a newborn son and a 2-year-old daughter. What developed between Fisher and Taylor across those months of proximity and shared grief was eventually documented as an affair. The timeline of when the emotional connection deepened into something beyond consolation is not something that the historical record has established with precision, and it may not be something that Fisher and Taylor themselves could have identified precisely. Grief and intimacy are not always separate things, and the specific dynamics of two people sharing the loss of someone they both loved are complicated in ways that moral categories don't fully capture. What is documented is that by the fall of 1958, the affair was known to the press, and by the standards of American public morality in 1958, the affair was a scandal of significant proportions. The specific geometry of the situation was the thing that made it so combustible. It was not simply that Eddie Fisher had been unfaithful to his wife. The entertainment world of the 1950s contained considerable infidelity and managed it with relative discretion. It was the specific triangulation involved. He had been unfaithful with the widow of his best friend, whom he was supposed to be comforting. He was leaving his wife and 2 small children, one of whom was named after the dead man whose widow he was now pursuing. And his wife was Debbie Reynolds, America's sweetheart, who was universally liked and who had done nothing publicly visible to deserve what was happening to her. The public had a clear villain and a clear victim. The villain was Eddie Fisher. The victim was Debbie Reynolds. Elizabeth Taylor, whose grief was genuine and who was not, in any historical assessment, a predator in this situation, was also condemned, though her condemnation was of a different register. Fisher's condemnation was the one that destroyed a career. The public verdict and the fall. The coverage that followed the revelation of the affair was, by the standards of 1958, extraordinary. The tabloids and gossip columns that constituted the celebrity journalism of the late 1950s had not seen material this rich in years. Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, the 2 most powerful gossip columnists in Hollywood, women whose favor could make a career and whose condemnation could end one, both wrote about the situation extensively. The coverage was almost entirely sympathetic to Debbie Reynolds and almost entirely condemnatory of Fisher. Reynolds gave interviews that were precisely calibrated to maximize the sympathy she was receiving, not dishonestly, but with the instinct of a performer who understood how she was being seen and who was not going to undermine the advantage the situation had given her. She was photographed in her kitchen washing dishes, looking like the very definition of the abandoned American wife. She was restrained and dignified and visibly hurt. And the American public responded with precisely the combination of sympathy for her and anger at Fisher that the situation seemed designed to produce. Eddie Cantor, the mentor who had discovered Fisher and made his career possible, publicly broke with him over the affair. This was not a symbolic gesture. Cantor was a genuine power in the industry, and his public disavowal of Fisher sent a signal through every corner of entertainment that there would be no institutional protection for what Fisher had done. The industry was distancing itself, the audience was distancing itself, and the specific commercial infrastructure that Fisher had built, the television show, the record deals, the endorsement relationships, the public persona of the beloved young man from Philadelphia who had made good, began to collapse. The radio stations that had been playing his records began receiving mail demanding that they stop. Fans who had screamed for him at concerts mailed back his records. His television show, The Eddie Fisher Show, which had succeeded Coke Time on NBC, was cancelled in 1959. Advertisers who had been paying to associate their products with his name withdrew. The Coca-Cola deal, worth $1 million in 1954, was ancient history. The man who had been one of the most commercially valuable entertainers in America was now a liability. Fisher divorced Debbie Reynolds in February 1959. He married Elizabeth Taylor on May 12, 1959, in Las Vegas. He was 30. She was 27. The marriage produced immediate industry consequences. The public had not forgiven either of them. Taylor lost several film roles and endorsement arrangements in the period immediately following the scandal, but the specific consequences for Fisher were considerably more severe, because his career was built on public affection in a way that Elizabeth Taylor's was not. Taylor was a film actress whose work was evaluated on screen, where personal morality was somewhat insulated from box office performance. Fisher was a recording artist and television personality whose product was essentially himself, his likability, his warmth, his accessibility to the audience. When the audience withdrew its affection, the product ceased to exist. He tried to continue recording. The records sold less well than they had before, then less well still, then barely at all. He tried to continue performing live. The venues were smaller than they had been, then smaller still. He had given up the career for the relationship, and the career was not going to come back. The marriage to Elizabeth Taylor. The 5 years of Fisher's marriage to Elizabeth Taylor were, in certain respects, the most extraordinary and in others the most painful years of his life. Taylor was, by the end of the 1950s, approaching the peak of her commercial and artistic power. Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 1958 had demonstrated that she was capable of genuinely important dramatic work. Her performance as Maggie the Cat, the sexually frustrated wife in Tennessee, Williams's corrosive dissection of a Southern family, had confirmed what perceptive observers had been suggesting since at least A Place in the Sun in 1951, which was that the beautiful face was a delivery system for a talent that went considerably deeper than beauty. Suddenly, last summer, in 1959, confirmed it. Butterfield 8 in 1960, in which Fisher appeared in a supporting role, one of his relatively rare film appearances representing his acting career at a moment when his singing career had stalled, won Taylor the Academy Award for Best Actress. Fisher later said, in interviews with the rueful honesty of someone who has had decades to process what happened, that he was not the right person for Elizabeth Taylor and that Elizabeth Taylor was not the right person for him. That they had come together in grief and had found, in the specific heat and intensity of that grief, something that felt like the thing they needed, and that turned out, over 5 years of daily life, to be something considerably less stable than that. He loved her. He has said so consistently, and the consistency has the quality of genuine feeling rather than performance. He was also, in the marriage, considerably less than her equal, in fame, in career, in the specific gravity that the most celebrated woman in the world generates in her personal life. He was a diminished figure at the peak of an enormous one, and the daily experience of that disproportion was something the love could not entirely compensate for. He has described in his memoir managing aspects of her professional life, accompanying her to events, being the person whose role was defined by proximity to her rather than by his own identity. He gave up the career for the relationship, and the career was not going to come back, and the relationship was not going to provide the replacement that might have made the sacrifice feel worth it. The marriage lasted 5 years. The ending came in Rome. In 1962, Elizabeth Taylor was in Rome filming Cleopatra, the most expensive film in Hollywood history to that point, a production so vast and troubled that it nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox. Richard Burton had been cast as Mark Antony. Burton was a Welsh actor of genuinely remarkable gifts, one of the most powerful stage presences in the British theatre, possessed of a voice that critics described in terms usually reserved for musical instruments, carrying the specific kind of magnetism that made rooms rearrange themselves around wherever he was standing. He was also married to Sybil Williams, who was at home in England. The affair between Taylor and Burton began on the set in early 1962, and it was not discreet. In Rome, at the height of the paparazzi culture that Italian celebrity journalism had developed into a genuine industry, the relationship between Taylor and Burton became one of the most photographed events of the decade. Fisher was in Rome. He could read the Italian newspapers. He knew. He confronted Taylor. The confrontation did not resolve in his favor. By 1964, Taylor had filed for divorce. She married Burton 11 days after the divorce from Fisher was finalized, in March 1964, in Montreal. The same public that had been scandalized by Fisher and Taylor in 1959 was now scandalized by Taylor and Burton, with the difference that the new scandal had a different quality of fascination. Taylor and Burton were two colossal forces meeting in Rome. Fisher had been a young singer from South Philly. The world watched the new story with the same relentless attention it had brought to the old one, and the symmetry was not lost on anyone. Fisher had been the person who abandoned his family for the widow. He was now the person who had been abandoned. The press noted the symmetry, the sympathy that might have flowed toward him as the betrayed party was limited by the public's memory of how he had become the betraying party 5 years earlier. The marriages that followed. The story of Eddie Fisher after Elizabeth Taylor is the story of a man trying, across successive decades, to find something that the combination of early fame and its specific losses had left him unable to locate, and perhaps something that the specific way he had grown up, in the specific circumstances of South Philadelphia and the entertainment industry's version of immigrant success, had made genuinely difficult to identify. He filed for bankruptcy in 1970 in San Juan, Puerto Rico, listing $916,300 in debts against $40,000 in assets. This was the specific arithmetic of what the Taylor scandal and its aftermath had produced financially. The man who had earned $1 million from a single Coca-Cola contract 16 years earlier was now legally insolvent, listing the debts of a failed career and the costs of 2 marriages and their divorces. His third marriage was to actress Connie Stevens, known for her role in the television series Hawaiian Eye and for her own modest recording career. Stevens was 28 years old and at a reasonably active point in her career. They married in 1967 and had 2 daughters together, Joalie Fisher and Tricia Lee Fisher, both of whom eventually became actresses themselves. carrying the performance talent of their family in ways that were genuinely their own. The marriage lasted 2 years and ended in 1969, another divorce in a life that was accumulating them. He married a fourth time in 1975 to Terry Richard, a beauty queen who was 26 years his junior. He was 47 years old and she was 21. The marriage lasted 10 months. He later described the marriage with the wry brevity that the 10-month duration seemed to invite. His fifth marriage, in 1993, to Betty Lin, a Chinese-born businesswoman, lasted the longest of any of his marriages, enduring until Betty Lin's death in 2001. He was 72 years old when he lost her. Her death came after decades of departures that had been chosen rather than inflicted, and it was experienced differently for that reason. He continued performing across all of these years. He appeared in Las Vegas, in smaller venues than the ones that had defined the peak of his career in the 1950s. But he kept working with the persistence of a man from South Philadelphia who had not developed an alternative to work. The voice remained. It was a genuine instrument that had aged, but not disappeared. And the people who came to see him in his later performing years heard something real. He recorded periodically. He did television interviews. He published his memoirs. My Story in 1981 and Been There, Done That in 1999. With the honesty of someone who had processed a life's worth of decisions and arrived at something like acceptance. His daughter, Carrie Fisher, the daughter he had with Debbie Reynolds, the daughter who became one of the most beloved and most candidly self-examining public figures of her generation, who made her own mental health struggles and her complicated relationship with her famous father into material for writing that people found both brilliantly funny and genuinely useful, spoke and wrote about him with a complexity that reflected the complexity of what he had been to her. She loved him. She was angry with him. She was fascinated by him. She was, in the specific way of children whose parents are famous and flawed, trying to understand someone who was simultaneously the person she knew from childhood and the person the world had made into a story. Carrie Fisher died on December 28, 2016, 4 days after suffering a cardiac event on a transatlantic flight. She was 60 years old. Eddie Fisher had died 6 years earlier, on September 22, 2010, at the age of 82, in Berkeley, California, from complications following hip surgery. He had outlived one of his marriages and the wife of another, and in the ordering of death, preceded his daughter by 6 years. What the career had been and what was left. The distance between what Eddie Fisher's career was in 1955 and what it was in 1965 is one of the more dramatic career collapses in the history of American popular music. And the cause is unusual, because it was not musical. He did not become a less gifted singer. He did not lose his voice. It remained a genuine instrument of real quality well into his later performing years. He did not fail to understand the changing musical landscape in the way that many pop singers of his era did when rock and roll arrived and remade the market. The specific timing of his scandal, beginning in 1958, the same year that Elvis Presley was transforming American popular music from its foundations, meant that Fisher was navigating the public's moral judgment at the exact moment that the musical context for his career was also being dismantled. Even without the scandal, the pop market that had made him the biggest thing in American music was being reorganized around a different set of values. The scandal simply accelerated what the music would have accomplished more slowly. The specific injustice of this is worth sitting with. Fisher was not the only person in the triangle who made choices that damaged other people. Elizabeth Taylor was not an innocent party in any strict sense. Debbie Reynolds, who was the wronged party and whose dignity throughout was genuine and admirable, went on to have a successful and long career. She continued working as an actress and as a Las Vegas performer for decades, built a remarkable private collection of Hollywood memorabilia, maintained a warmth and humor about the situation that were characteristic of her, and eventually reached a genuine reconciliation with Taylor, the woman who had been her closest friend, before becoming the woman who had changed her life. Reynolds lived until 2016, dying just one day after her daughter Carrie. In the very end, they were together. The man in the triangle received the most severe professional punishment. He received it most durably, and he received it because his specific kind of stardom, built entirely on the public's sense of him as someone to be trusted and loved, was the kind most vulnerable to the public's moral judgment. Taylor's stardom survived because it was built on something the public could watch on a screen and evaluate for itself. Fisher's stardom had no such foundation when the affection was withdrawn. He filed for bankruptcy in 1970, listing nearly $1 million in debt against $40,000 in assets. The man who had earned $1 million from a single Coca-Cola contract 15 years earlier was now legally insolvent. He continued performing across the following decades. The voice remained. He appeared in Las Vegas, in smaller venues than the ones that had defined the peak years, but he kept working with the stubbornness of a man from South Philadelphia who did not have a large repertoire of alternative choices. He recorded. He gave interviews. He told his story, in 1981 in My Story, and in 1999 in Been There, Done That, with the honesty that comes from someone who has processed a life's worth of decisions and arrived at something like acceptance without entirely arriving at peace. His daughter Carrie's death in 2016, the bright and complicated daughter who had made her own complicated childhood and complicated father into material for her brilliant writing, preceded his own death by 6 years. He had died on September 22, 2010, in Berkeley, California, at the age of 82. The obituaries all contained the same sentence. They all described him as the singer who left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor. It was the sentence his life had been organized around since 1958. He had, before that sentence, been the most beloved young singer in America. He had been the man Harry Truman loved and Eisenhower loved and teenagers across the country loved. He had been the voice between Sinatra and Elvis, the bridge between two eras, the boy from South Philly who made it all the way. After that sentence, he had the rest of his life, which was both more and less than what the career had been. He had children who loved him. He had the memory of Mike Todd, and of what it felt like to be someone's best friend in the full sense of the word. He had the knowledge of what he had chosen and what it had cost. He had, by his own account, no lasting regrets about the love itself, only about the consequences, which were permanent and which the love was not sufficient to redeem. The man, the scandal, made permanent. Eddie Fisher died on September 22, 2010, in Berkeley, California, of complications following hip surgery. He was 82 years old. The obituaries that ran in newspapers across America described him, with the consistency that the story had always produced, as the singer who left Debbie Reynolds for Elizabeth Taylor. This was in every obituary. It was the sentence that his life had been organized around since 1958. He had, before that sentence, sold tens of millions of records and sold out concerts across America for years. He had hosted a television show that one of the largest corporations in the world had paid $1 million to sponsor. He had performed for presidents. He had been the object of a fandom that presaged what rock and roll would eventually produce at much larger scale. He had, in the specific cultural moment between the era of Sinatra and the era of Elvis, been the biggest thing in American popular music. After that sentence, he had 5 marriages and 4 divorces and a bankruptcy, and a career that persisted in diminished forms across decades. He had children who loved him and were also wounded by him. He had a daughter who became more famous than he ever was, who processed her relationship with him in public, who died 6 years after he did and left behind a body of writing that contained, among much else, the complicated portrait of a famous father. The affair that destroyed his reputation was not, in the most honest accounting, an act of malice. It was not a predatory calculation. It was what happens when grief and proximity and desire operate on human beings who have not developed the specific capacity to resist what they are feeling. Fisher loved Mike Todd. He was genuinely devastated by Mike Todd's death. And in the specific and disorienting proximity of grief, something developed between him and the woman who had also loved Mike Todd that he was not capable of not pursuing. Whether that excuses the consequences for Debbie Reynolds and their children is a separate question, and one that only the people who lived it can answer. Reynolds found it possible, over the years, to arrive at something like forgiveness, and eventually at a reconciliation with Taylor, the woman who had also been a participant in what happened. Whether she arrived at the same place with Fisher is something the record doesn't fully document. What the record does document is the specific and permanent cost of a single decision made by a man at the peak of his fame and the depth of his grief. A decision that the American public made into the defining fact of his life, and that he spent the next 5 decades living inside. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.